and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Good morning. My name is Christine Organ. I would like to thank you all for welcoming me here this morning. I first spoke here last summer, and you all were so kind and supportive that when Reverend Hillary asked if I would be up for it again, I didn't think twice. Well, that's not entirely true. Last night I might have gotten a little bit nervous and had a few second thoughts, but in any event, I am happy to be here now. This morning I'd like to talk about the spiritual practice of story sharing. And what better way to talk about story sharing than to begin by sharing my own. My husband and I have been members of Countryside for about 4 years now. I came to Countryside during a time of significant change and uncertainty in my life, much like I came to Unitarian Universalism 8 years ago. It all began on Christmas Eve when I found myself sitting on a pew, like so many other pews, in a church like so many other churches, during a Christmas Eve service like so many other Christmas Eve services. Little girls were dressed in red velvet dresses with black bows that tied at the back. Little boys wore crisp white shirts with brand new sweater vests. The service was nice, the quintessential Christmas pageant, but there was nothing particularly remarkable about it. Songs were sung, readings were read, prayers were recited, the nativity story was acted out, more carols were sung, and a collection was taken up. Yet somehow, on that Christmas Eve afternoon, in a church service like other church services with absolutely nothing remarkable about it, everything changed for me. Because it was during that unremarkable church service that I underwent a monumental spiritual and religious shift that, at the risk of sounding a little dramatic, just might have changed my life. Until that point, I had, maybe like many of us here today, considered myself a Christian. I believed what I was told, and if I had doubts, I pushed them aside. But during that Christmas Eve service, while other Christians dutifully went about honoring a holiday that was the very foundation of that belief system, I felt as if the dam holding back those pushed aside and neglected doubts had broken open, with the doubts flooding me all at once in a wave so strong and urgent that it began to feel like I was drowning. Toward the end of the service, my husband and I made the Catholic exit, leaving right after communion but before the end of the service. And as soon as we were out the doors, I blurted out some of my doubts. "Quiet," he whispered. "We're still in the parking lot. We could be struck down by lightning if you say this something like that." I laughed and dropped the issue for the time being, but the doubts wouldn't go away. The rest of that holiday was filled with the usual parties and gifts, food and family. But despite the festivities, I found it nearly impossible to celebrate and enjoy the holidays. You see, compounding all of these doubts and frustrations was the fact that I was struggling with a kind of inner chaos as well. My first son had been born 2 months prior, and along with all of the typical struggles that most first-time parents feel, fear, uncertainty, and complete and utter exhaustion, I also felt this enormous emptiness. Things that had once been enjoyable were now bland and empty. A persistent confusion clouded my thoughts, and a quiet rage had begun to boil inside of me. I have since learned that this condition has a name, postpartum depression, but at the time it just felt as if the lights had gone out on everything. In the past, during difficult times, I would have fallen back on my faith to see me through, but now, with all of these doubts, I felt even more lost. Who was I? Where did I belong? And what could I do with all of these doubts and questions? My faith journey had begun, like the faith journey of many of us begins, I suppose, with an inherited faith. In fact, my inherited faith was an entire way of life. My parents and extended family were all devout Catholics, and church attendance was pretty much a given, whether on a Saturday afternoon or Sunday morning, whether at our home parish or at a random church if we were traveling. In fact, the first question posed to hotel staff on nearly every family vacation was not, "Can you recommend a good restaurant?" but rather, "Where is the closest Catholic church and what time is Mass?" For most of my life, I rather blindly followed this inherited faith. I didn't question. It was too confusing to question. I didn't rebel. I wasn't really the rebellious type. Instead, I attended, I sang, I repeated, I chanted, I accepted a wafer every Sunday, and didn't think much about my faith or spirituality, all in the hopes of feeling more connected to God, my family, and to myself. But on that blustery Christmas Eve, amidst all of the mental turmoil and spiritual confusion, I found myself falling into what has been called the belief gap. In her book, Christianity After Religion, Diana Butler Bass describes the belief gap as this. What once made sense no longer did. It was not a case of rejecting everything. Rather, it was more like seeing from some angle you never imagined, like slipping off a wet rock and finding yourself in the river rather than above it. There are lots of questions when you slip. Will I stop falling? Will I regain my footing? Will I reach solid ground? Where will the current take me? But not only was falling into the belief gap that Christmas Eve like falling into a river, it was like falling into a river with rapids and waterfalls and sharp rocks, all without a life jacket. Before long, it felt like I lost complete control and I was swirling into this river of doubt where absolutely nothing made sense. The act of questioning, seeking, and exploring led to more questioning, more seeking, more exploring. Not only was I unable to find some kind of connection, I felt like I was losing what tenuous connections I did have. Up until this point, religion had been closely tied with my identity, and I would always define myself as a Christian. It provided a certain sense of belonging, a way of life, and a kind of routine. So without this identity, I wasn't really sure where I belonged anymore. Months passed, and my doubts continued to take hold. I admitted to myself that in order to be true to my own beliefs, I could not practice in a Christian religion. With this realization came immense freedom, but there also came a certain kind of mourning. I mourned the loss of my inherited faith and the comfort that comes with sharing a faith with so many people that I love. I mourned the connection and sense of belonging that this shared faith brought. But with this sense of mourning also came a resolute determination. I didn't want to give up on spiritual and religious community entirely. And despite the fact that my beliefs were inconsistent with the faith that I had been brought up in, I was also really grateful for the strong spiritual foundation that my parents had provided, and I was committed to doing the same for my own children. So I set out to find a solution. I talked to people and I asked questions. I read a lot of self-help books and books by Eckhart Tolle. I even consulted the all-knowing Google. Finally, one night, my sister said, "Maybe you're Unitarian." Maybe, I thought. But what's a Unitarian? So, on one early spring morning, my husband and I cautiously entered the doors of Second Unitarian in Chicago. And I wondered, where has this religion been all my life, and why is it taking me so long to find it? In many ways, it almost seemed too good to be true. Unitarian Universalism matched my spiritual, ethical, and societal values. I didn't need to ascribe to any doctrine that I didn't believe. And the church was a vibrant and welcoming community. For 2.5 years, I clawed my way out of the belief gap, began to recover from the postpartum depression, and thrived within this spiritual community. We attended church, joined committees, and made friends. I finally felt like I belonged. I felt connected, and I felt home. But then, more chaos and change. After a series of significant challenges that are the subject of another story entirely, within a few months, we had a baby, moved to the suburbs, settled into a fixer-upper that left us without a kitchen and me mixing bottles in the bathroom, and started the process of creating a new life in a new city. Once again, it felt like we were living inside a snow globe that kept getting shaken up. We sporadically began attending Countryside shortly after moving to Arlington Heights. But for several reasons, we just couldn't commit to a religious community. There was just too much upheaval, too much change, and too much uncertainty. I felt wishy-washy and unable to make any decisions. And though I felt as certain as ever that my religious home was in Unitarian Universalism, I once again felt like I didn't quite know where I belonged. I felt a little lost and disconnected. Eventually, slowly at first, and then with a bit more enthusiasm, we did commit to Countryside, and after a few years, I can say that I once again have made it out of the belief gap. I feel connected, like I belong. I feel like I am home. In many ways, the story of my faith journey is pretty unremarkable. It's like the faith journey of so many others, and maybe some of you here today. No major conversion, no baptism in the river, no cultural shift. The change was gradual and somewhat discreet. But in other ways, in more personal ways, My faith journey feels almost miraculous. If for no other reason than it provided me with the gift of an authentic faith, a comfort that slips through the fingers of so many people. So, why am I telling you all of this? Why am I sharing the story of my faith journey with you all this morning? And for that matter, why does anyone share their story? What do we have to gain from it? Well, 3 things: freedom, connection, and feeling. Many of us are hesitant to share our stories, especially the stories of our faith journey. Maybe we think our story lacks originality. It might not have the flair or intrigue that other stories have. Like my own somewhat unremarkable faith journey from Christianity to Unitarian Universalism, we might assume that our story is too boring or too unoriginal, so why even bother telling it? Or maybe our story is messy and confusing and tied up with any number of other soft spots in our lives: our families, our culture, our heritage, maybe even our political and social attitudes. Oftentimes it seems we can't offer up our faith stories without opening a Pandora's box of other wounds and sensitivities and touchy subjects. We might be ashamed of our stories and unresolved with their grittiness, so we hide from them, tuck them away, and pretend they aren't there. Unfortunately, when we hide from our stories or lock them up inside, neglecting to share them, we create these walls around ourselves and from ourselves. We make it easier to rely on labels and judgments and stereotypes instead of really getting to know one another and ourselves. We perpetuate an ongoing cycle of inauthenticity, shame, and false pretenses. Of course, no one said story sharing is easy. It is hard, excruciatingly hard sometimes. And in today's day and age of up-to-the-minute Facebook status updates, cookies that monitor our online behavior, photos that can be tweeted out to millions of people, there's an increasing need to protect our stories and preserve some level of privacy. We need to be careful about how we share our stories and when we share our stories and with whom we share our stories. But when our stories are told with truth and respect to people who care about and respect us, we create an opportunity for deeper and more meaningful connections. The process can not only be liberating, freeing us from cycles of shame and guilt, but it can be healing and spiritually enlightening as well. Story sharing can be a spiritual practice in and of itself. Brene Brown, a psychologist who writes extensively on the subject of fame, shame, and authenticity, wrote this in her book, Daring Greatly. If we share our story with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, shame cannot survive. Owning our story can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. Embracing our vulnerabilities is risky, but not nearly as dangerous as giving up on love and belonging and joy, the experiences that make us the most vulnerable. Only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light. When we share our stories, we can begin to break through the darkness and use our infinite power of light to connect on a deeper and more meaningful level with ourselves, with our spirituality, with our loved ones, our communities, with our congregation. Because sharing stories isn't just an action or a recounting of events, but a spiritual practice. It is a way of opening ourselves up to the truth that lies within, allowing ourselves to be seen fully and completely, and honoring the sacred connection that can flow from the act of opening ourselves up and sharing a piece of ourselves with others. As Brene Brown also wrote in another of her books, The Gifts of Imperfection, we cultivate love when we allow our most vulnerable and powerful selves to be deeply seen and known, and when we honor the spiritual connection that grows from that offering with trust, respect, kindness, and affection. So, stories set us free and stories help us connect, but they also make us feel. Last week when my husband came home from work, I asked him how his day was. He shrugged and said, "Oh, fine." Well, I cried twice. Now, as a lawyer, let me assure you that announcing that the big event of the day was crying twice is not something that happens all that often. So what brought my litigator of a husband to tears not once, but twice? Stories. He had gone to an event for a social organization that he is a part of, and he had listened to stories. Hard stories and uplifting stories, stories of struggle and challenge, stories of redemption and beauty. We can get caught up in the philosophy and facts and statistics and the rational reasons for this or that, But when you get down to it, the thing that moves us, the thing that calls us to action, the thing that connects us is our stories. As Unitarian Universalists, I think that many of us shy away from our stories, particularly the stories of our faith journey. We might be haunted by the scars left by a restrictive and authoritarian religion, or we might be confused by our evolving faith and beliefs. We might struggle to find the words to describe our faith journey, or we might think that our faith journey, like mine, is somewhat ordinary and maybe of little interest to anyone but ourselves. But as a congregation, it is critically important that we create the space for the spiritual practice of story sharing, both the telling of and listening to our stories, in order to grow stronger as a faith community. With each story shared, we can begin to see each other not just as another face in the crowd, but as a unique and complex people. We can see not just the quilted fabric of our congregation, but each individual thread that makes up that quilt. By sharing our stories, we can grow stronger as a faith community, deepen our spiritual connections, and empower ourselves to explore what it means to live out our Unitarian Universalist faith in practical and meaningful ways. It is with these goals in mind that I'm happy to announce that soon we'll be bringing back Countryside's tradition of personal testaments, with a twist. At least 3 times a year, or perhaps more often, members of Countryside will have the opportunity to tell their stories in their own words and through songs and readings. Now, some of you might be panicking a little right now, thinking, please no, not me. Well, don't worry, no one will be asked to share their faith story unless you are ready and willing to do so. For those of you who aren't ready, we simply ask that you listen to the stories of others, be respectful and mindful, and create the space for deeper connection. For those of you who may be ready, but are a little overwhelmed and intimidated by the process, I will assure you that there will be plenty of help, guidance, coaching, and cheerleading support along the way. The experience of story sharing in our congregation and in so many other UU congregations benefits the listeners by reminding us of our diverse histories and the uniqueness of our beliefs. It benefits the storytellers by providing a tool for self-discovery and affirmation. And it benefits the congregation as a whole by supporting at least 2 of our principles: the search for truth and meaning, and the encouragement of spiritual growth. I, along with Reverend Hillary, ask that each of you seriously consider sharing your faith story with the congregation when and as you are comfortable. If you're interested, please let me know or bring any questions that you may have. Every story is important. Every story has value. Every story is beautiful. Every story makes up something bigger, stronger, deeper. We've all come to this faith community from a number of different places on a number of different paths, and though we share religious ties and make up the same faith community, we continue to walk on a multitude of different spiritual paths. By sharing our experiences and honoring our histories, we can grow together as a stronger, more connected faith community as we work towards serving the bigger picture and creating a better future. And even outside of the walls of this faith community, share your stories. Not just your faith stories, but anything that enables freedom, connection, and feeling with your family, friends, neighbors, and communities. And so, I would like to end with just one final story. Some of you might know that I'm a writer, and given that most of my writing is in the form of personal essay, I tend to be fairly comfortable sharing my stories. But a few months ago, I found myself struggling significantly with a piece that I was writing about postpartum depression, since the article touched on some very sensitive issues, deep wounds, and jagged scars. I went back and forth about whether or not I could write the article, and whether I even should write the article. I worried that the story was too dark and depressing, that others might judge me. I worried that the story would just cut up old wounds for no good reason. I went back and forth about it, talked with some good friends, and ultimately decided to go ahead with the article. And I am so glad that I did. Not only did sharing the story help me come to terms with these wounds and scars, but it also forged deeper and more meaningful connections. Sharing the story provided a springboard for me and my mom to talk about things that had gone unsaid until that point, so that we are now able to know each other more fully. It helped friends and family understand me a little better. It brought to light the need for postpartum support services, and it created connections between others who had also struggled with or were continuing to struggle with similar issues. Was telling that story hard? You bet. But the connection and freedom that a shared story can bring far outweigh the discomfort. And so I'd like to close with just a few words from that difficult but oh so worth it article that I wrote. We've all got our stories. There are the polite small talk stories that we exchange with our work colleagues and parents at school drop-off. There are the soundbite stories that we post to Facebook. There are the made-up stories that we sometimes tell ourselves, the half-truth stories that we tell family and friends, the stories of omission that we communicate with our silence. And then there are the real stories, the awkward stories, the painful stories, the complicated stories, and the beautiful stories. And honestly, those real stories are so much better than all the other stories anyway. So whatever your real story is, whether it's picture perfect or dark and blemished, own it and accept it. And when you're ready, tell your story with kindness and tenderness, because inside the gnarled and complicated real story, there is a resilient peace and a quiet power, and with each real story shared comes a tiny slice of freedom. Let us share, let us connect, let us be free. May it be so. Amen.